Hello, I'm Kenny and welcome to Tool Talk. Today on Tool Talk we are talking about the Rotolight Titan X1 and X2. Recently I was tasked with reviewing the Rotolight Titan X1 and X2 panels, the highlight feature of which is the tunable Smart Soft diffusion, acting essentially as a spot flood knob like on a traditional fixture. And you can think of these as being comparable to something like a Sky Panel S30/S60, an Aperture Nova, or Light Panels Gemini, something like that. While the Titan X1 came to me as a full package, the X2 came straight off the floor at Filmtools, so all I had was the light itself and the power ballast and cables. I'm actually using the X2 as ambient lighting in here right now to match the incoming sunlight, and that it's set to 45%, and we're getting kind of an f5.6, f4 in here right now. And the color temperature coming through the window was 6,000, so I set that to 6,000. These lights are different ones. So overall, these are some really solid studio lights that would be worth looking into if you are in the market. As an ethics statement, I am being paid to do this review, but neither Rotolight nor Filmtools have had any input in this video, and the words are my own independent thoughts. And in truth, I've never even met or spoken to anyone at Rotolight, so that being said, let's dive in. Firstly, the travel case, the hard case, is really awesome, really sturdy. Reminds me of the gear cases we'd use to house like rack-mounted computers and effects in live music, so it's awesome. It's got a little compartment for the ballast and necessary cables, as well as handles on all sides and a set of wheels on one corner, so moving it around is really easy and you're not banging it against your foot like I've had with some other ones. The lights themselves are built super solidly, but the trade-off there obviously is weight. The X1, even in the case, can be lifted by one person in the back of a truck or whatever with relatively minimal grunting, but the X2 is pretty heavy and only has a junior pin on the receiver, so only has a junior pin on the yoke. So you'll need to account for that when you're putting it up. A regular C-stand will not do. Another nice thing about the build of these units is that they have handles built in on the top and bottom of the frame, so they're really easy to carry. So that's a nice touch. The X2 isn't so heavy that like you couldn't do it. I can lift it with one hand. They're also easy to place on the ground vertically. Not vertically, I guess horizontally, but standing up if you were so inclined. It certainly makes things easier when you're just able to put the light down when you're talking about what to do next or whatever. The touchscreen on the back is fantastic and easy to use, and the knobs are built out of metal and feel really robust, and everything there is just great. There's also like soft touch buttons surrounding the touchscreen, but I never really use them except for the one to go home. But they bring you the SFX, DMX, wired and wireless, and flash menus. So this panel can be used as a photographic flash, which is neat. The ease at which you can adjust settings with the touchscreen or the knobs is awesome, and I really actually look forward to seeing other manufacturers implementing similar situations and build qualities. I also found that you can't really accidentally touch the screen and adjust the values, in the sense that you have to like precisely touch the little indicator cursor to move it around. You can't just like tap around the LCD screen at the part of the spectrum that you want and have it instantly move there. And that annoyed me at first, but since that's how you're used to kind of regular touchscreens working, like your phone. But the more I thought about it, the more I'm like, well, it's probably better that it takes some precision to adjust things so that you don't accidentally change something while you're like putting the light up or whatever. The XY like spectrum does actually work the usual way, so to speak. So you can, like, if the little cursor's over here, you can click here and it'll jump over there. In any case, of the options on the back, you've got standard CCT, white balance, as well as HSI, RGBW, filter, and the XY coordinates. I was most excited to test out XY, but it doesn't seem to use CCT, opting instead for RGB in regards to the lights. That does make matching lights difficult, like standard sources. It essentially just gives you one of the filter options, which are more color than light. So in other words, the XY coordinates are better for matching like party lights, so to speak, than a white light. It's somewhat of a bummer for me because that's primarily what I'd use them for. You just meter your incoming source, the sun maybe, and then put those exact XY coordinates in the back of the unit, and then they should match. But obviously that, even though it doesn't do that, it still has its utility for matching non-white light sources, but just dialing in the proper color temperature in the CCT mode allowed me to match to existing sources like this really easily. Best to just stick to using the CCT to match the white light sources, which isn't a huge surprise. And even here, like I'm doing the classic, just bounce the thing into this ceiling for ambient fill. I set the temperature to match. Then I just looked at the ceiling and dialed the tint till the color was all one color. Now we've got a very even look. The color temperature you get is pretty accurate to what you dial in on the back of the unit, which is great. Only off by a couple hundred Kelvin at the worst, and usually only by double digits in general. But the diffusion does change things a bit, which we'll get to in a second. Part of me wishes the tint slider was expressed with like a standard gel increment or something, so you could use it more effectively with your color meter. But that's me being nitpicky, because you can probably trust your eyes with the tint, as I've done here, but also like no lights or even cameras seem to have a standardized tint thing that they all use, so whatever. Brightness is definitely not something these fixtures struggle with. This X2 is bright. At 9 feet, I was getting an f8 at 100% at ISO 824 frames. With the diffusion fully on, and f11 with the diffusion off. Even with the X1 in this interview situation I was doing, at like 3.5%, I was getting the 2.8 I needed for that situation. So very powerful. The X2 easily turned this office, it's like 13 by 13, into looking like it was lit by the midday sun at night. So you can really get some solid values in studio style shooting situations really easily, or outside you could get a good fill. There are a few things that I feel like are missteps, as with any product. For instance, the cable to the ballast is like too short for my liking, so you really have to either mount the ballast to the back of the unit, which makes it heavy, or mount it directly under the light with the little clamp. And you can't just place it on the ground or hang it somewhere. I'm sure they make longer power cables, that's awesome, but the stock ones that it came with are short. An issue with mounting the ballast to the back of the light, aside from the weight, is if you have it above head height and you want to adjust something, the ballast box is in the way of the touchscreen and you can't see or touch anything. So it also does this thing that all light panels like this seem to do, regardless of manufacturer, which is where the cable bumps the bottom of the yoke, so you can't really like turn it upward. I feel like it would wear down the cable or something, but it makes it difficult and could ruin the cable. I'd love to see a panel where the power cable is angled in such a way that the light can rotate more or less unencumbered. But speaking of the yoke, the brake on the yoke is excellent. Nothing wrong with that. And like I said, the whole thing is built like a tank overall. Now about the diffusion, if I'm honest, it's not really a feature I'd spend too much time fussing with. It doesn't really do much except spread the light out a bit. So softness is unaffected because the size of the source relative to your subject doesn't change. But it also changes the spectral output ever so slightly. So I found that without the diffusion, the light was brighter, obviously, but less accurate to its intended CCT. But with the diffusion, the light was closer to the correct CCT target, but lost a point in TLCI, and in general seems to cool the light off a bit. I'm also noticing that the color temperature is even across the light when the diffusion is fully on, but is cooler in the middle and warmer around the edges when the diffusion is off. So in general, especially considering what people buy these types of panels for, like big even sources, I'd say just leave the diffusion on at 100% unless you really needed that extra stop or so of light, and that warm vignette isn't an issue. It basically turns it into a, I don't know, like a Fresnel kind of look, a little hard in the middle and soft around the edges, but play with it. It's a fun addition. As I mentioned at the top, the X1 is obviously smaller and a bit easier to wrangle, so I used that instead of the X2 on a recent interview gig I had. I was like underground in a small bar, so the X2 plus the giant junior stand I have would not fit, and I didn't want to haul them up and down stairs by myself and all that. But since interviews involve like pretty tight compositions, the X1 was just fine. I didn't need to light a big space, and in a perfect world, I probably would have put like a softbox on it or a 4x4 frame in front of it, but we were moving quickly, and again, it was too small of an area for extra grip anyway. But these are really soft and it worked out fine, and the Titans have a snap-in frame thingy, which makes switching softbox and whatever easy, and in my case held the barn doors. But also recently I'm kind of getting more into harder light anyway, so having a slightly smaller source than I wanted was fine. The bar I was shooting in was lit with LEDs of dubious quality. They're a little greenish looking, but they were all 2700 Kelvin. So while getting the key light to match the ambient exposure was trivial, the color temperature was ever so slightly cooler on the light, but that's fine because it was either simple to correct in post or completely unnecessary. But if you're in a situation where you needed a warm light, that is one thing you should know about. These only go down to 3000 Kelvin, but they do go up to 10,000 Kelvin. So the cooler end of the spectrum is perfectly achievable. You know, if you wanted to get crazy, you could use daylight as your warm light and something like 10,000 Kelvin as your daylight, set the camera appropriately, and there you go, you've got mixed color temperatures. But in any case, the light performed exactly as you'd hope in a simple situation like that, and actually elicited somewhat of a wow reaction from the client, who said nothing of the camera setup. So the tides are changing, people. Lights are impressive again. You know, so for nearly $3,000 less than a SkyPanel S60, the Rotolight Titan X2 is certainly a solid alternative to the current standards, performing admirably in both lab scenarios. I don't know if my office counts as a lab, and real world scenarios as well. I found the lights do exactly what they say on the box, in an elegant package, and that's all you can really ask for in a situation like this. So would I recommend them? Sure. Probably if you were, you know, in a studio situation, the X1 might be better for taking with you on the job because it would more easily fit in your car. But you know, they're great little lights, and they're actually made at Pinewood. They make them at Pinewood, where they make James Bond. So pedigree there. And something I'd like to add at the end of this, since this is our first tool talk in quite some time, and this is actually the announcement of it, I'm designing a light comparator. A friend of mine is programming it for me. It's going to be a website and hopefully an app in the future. But you know, I'll go through with my color meter and meter all the lights I possibly can, and then you can use this website to compare and contrast the spectral output, accuracy of color temperature, you know, CCT, or excuse me, TLCI, CRI, whatever, side by side. And so something like this Rotolight Titan, it did pretty good compared to a lot of other lights. I don't want to stir any stuff, but one of the lights that everyone uses, let's say, didn't perform as well as you'd think. So in any case, that's an aside for Kenny Talk there. That's the end of Tool Talk. I hope you found this informative, or you know, at least entertaining. So we'll see you next time here on the Tool Talk, and take care. The end. All right, it is Pinewood, right? It's Pinewood.